Our presentation is entitled The British English Rising Contour, an Exception in Read Speech. We will first briefly present our theoretical framework and give details on our corpus and method. We performed a quantitative analysis for which the results will be given, and then we will focus more widely on the qualitative analysis, which consisted in a thorough examination of the intonation contours in relation with syntax and the pragmatic functions of the contours. We shall then give the conclusions of our study and the perspectives it offers. Two parallel corpora were analysed, the English corpus and the Exox corpus, which were both firstly recorded for other studies on the acquisition of English L2 by French learners. When we listened to the recordings of the British English natives so as to make comparisons with the learners, we noticed an amazingly high proportion of falling contours in the read speech. We decided to analyze this speech style in order to extract the proportion of rising and falling tones and to determine where rises and falls occur and why. The present study therefore examines the speech of native English speakers. Our hypothesis is that incomplete statements, non-final tone units, usually described as displaying a non-fall contour, can be, and frequently are, pronounced with a falling tone in read speech, contrary to what is generally admitted. Our theoretical framework is the British School of Intonation. The British descriptions of intonation are based on a configurational approach, using the tone unit as the main constituent and defined as a complete, coherent intonation contour. A tone unit, a TU, comprises at least one syllable, which is necessarily the nuclear syllable or nucleus. The melodic movement starts on the nucleus and spreads on the post-nuclear syllables, if any. The British intonation system refers to the form of the global contour. Fall, rise, rise-fall, and fall-rise are the melodic movements commonly used to describe intonation in this tradition. The basic functions of intonation contours have largely been described for Southern British English. Falling contours are usually associated with the idea of finality and completeness, whereas rises are associated with continuity. For questions, WH questions are typically pronounced with falls, whereas yes-no questions are usually pronounced with a rise. As for complex contours, fall rises can have different functions. They can be associated with continuity, along with simple rises, as in initial adverbial phrases, for example. They can also be associated with some implication from the speaker. They can be used for contrast or to draw attention on what's going to follow. Rise falls are less common in Southern British English, and they can express surprise or irony. To sum up, according to the literature, non-finality is signaled by a non-fall, that is, a rise or a fall rise. As mentioned earlier, and we'll come back to that in a minute, our corpus consists of read speech. This is an important point, since it's known that intonation will vary according to speaking styles. In spontaneous speech, the speaker will tend to use rising contours until they have finished speaking and are ready to give up their speech turn. Rising contour, with pragmatic functions like HRTs, for instance, will also be more frequent in conversations. Hesitations are more common in non-prepared speech and will often trigger a rising contour. Falls are more frequent in formal speech. Teachers or members of parliament, for example, know that they will not be interrupted, so that they do not have to utter rising contours in order to keep the floor. In a very particular speaking style, like sports commentaries, for instance, a football game or a horse race, the journalist tends to use a lot of rising contours because they do not know what's going to happen. These rising contours allow the commentator to raise the suspense. In other types of journalistic speech, the intonation is very particular as well. Finally, in reading, a canonical intonation is expected. That is, a rising contour on non-final clauses and a final contour on and a falling contour, on final clauses. In order to test our hypothesis that rising contours are not that common on non-final tone units in reading style, we analyzed two corpora of read speech by native British English speakers. So we used the recordings of Euron 1 texts from English and ex-Oxar corpora. In fact, Euron 1 texts are short 5-sentence texts. There are 40, but for the present study, only 11 were used. Each text is read by 10 speakers, but in fact we have 20 speakers because some of them read 4 texts and others read 7 texts. All in all, 110 texts of an average 17 seconds were analyzed, which represents about 30 minutes of speech. A perception analysis was performed so as to divide the speech of the readers into tone units. Final and non-final tone units were annotated following Guttenhoven's tritonal approach. That is, only fall, rise, and fall rise are distinguished. The perceptive analysis was confronted with the acoustic signal using the Pratt software. The total number of tone units analyzed amounts to 1,071. Here are the results of the quantitative analysis. Concerning non-final tone units, 78.5% are produced with a fall. So contrary to what is generally admitted, the rising tone is far from being the most common contour for incomplete statements, as we see that only 14.5% rises were found and 7% fall rises were found. As far as final tone units are concerned, the most common tone is the fall with 85%, but of course this was expected. But we see here that the results between the non-final tone units and the final tone units are not very different. So the results are indisputable. Falls overwhelmingly dominate read speech. The two tables here show from left to right the results per speaker in the English corpus, 10 females reading the same 4 texts, and in the Exox corpus, 5 females and 5 males reading the same 7 texts. The high number of falling tones, whether tone unit is final or not, is clearly not gender related, nor is it speaker dependent.